Thanks so much, everybody. Welcome to Build. I'm your host, Ricky Camilleri. Next month, your favorite podcasters are all getting together for the 6th annual NYC Podfest. Today, we got DeRay McKesson here from Pod Save the People. Let's hear it. That's a slight pause there. Let's hear it means clap. You get on that. Catie Lazarus, Employee of the Month and creator of NYC Podfest, Jeremy Wein. Let's hear it, everybody. Before we start talking to them, we've got a quick clip, a trailer, a teaser, if you will, of the Podfest. Let's take a look at that. Everybody, please welcome DeRay McKesson, Catie Lazarus, and Jeremy Wein. Hey, everybody. Hey, guys.
Hey.
Thanks so much for being here. Congrats, 6 years.
Thank you.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's not too bad. It's old enough to start going to school now, which is nice.
What does that feel like? Does that actually feel like a thing, going to school? I mean, I know that's a metaphor of sorts, but at the same time, does it feel like it kind of runs itself to a certain degree?
I don't think it ever runs itself to a certain degree. What I think is nice is that we really are kind of like into the second kind of phase of what this event kind of looks like. So it's really, it's always a learning process from year to year, but it's nice to, you know, it's not a lot of events get to year 6, especially in New York City. So, you know, we're really proud of what the event has been and, you know, what's to come. And this year is very exciting.
Why is that?
So first of all, we're in a different venue this year. We're at the Abrams Arts Center. It's our biggest lineup yet. We have 24 shows in the festival. We're taking over 2 stages at this venue that is part of the Henry Street Settlement Project. It's one of the oldest continually operating like social services complexes in the city. It was established in like 1880, and then the Playhouse, where we're staging a lot of those shows, was founded in 1917. So our event is really like grassroots and like really built into the city. So to have our venue kind of reflect that is really exciting, and yeah.
Let's talk to our podcasters that are here on the stage with us. We have Catie and DeRay. Both of you have separate podcasts, Employee of the Month, and Pod Save the People, affiliated with Crooked Media, and Pod Save the World, and Pod Save America, and the whole bunch there. Catie, your podcast, Employee of the Month, is really wonderful. It's interviewing people who are sort of phenomenal at their jobs and talking to them about that. Can you talk to us about where you got the idea and what made you want to start podcasting and doing these interviews?
I wanted to be a writer. I had dropped out of my doctorate in clinical psych, and I wanted to be a comedy writer, and I couldn't get hired to write for the Weather Channel. Like, I could not. I'd be, like, second in line. And, like, one time I was, like, walking to a job, and then they called, and they're like, oh, we just decided to give it to the producer's nephew. He's adorable. And, like, I was, like, on my way there and had already signed a contract. So I started this show because I wanted to share with other people who are like, what are the logistical steps to break in? Like, I think sometimes you'll see there's these success stories and they have a narrative arc that we have now become such cliches, and I actually think a lot of them are not true, that there's a lot of luck involved, but I also wanted to find out the logistics. And
narrative arcs always leave out the intense amount of work that all the people put in before success, and it's so damaging to people who want to be successful in a chosen field, because you sort of really grow up hearing these arcs of like, yeah, I just like wrote this thing and threw a couple thousand at it and now I'm famous. And you're like, wait, what? And it's usually a much longer story than that.
Yeah, and sometimes people don't realize certain advantages or what people might call privileges that they have, and that can that's important to have someone who's willing to call out and ask about those things. And the reason that I'm asking is not to be mean, but more to just know what is it, you know. And there's certain things that are a secret sauce, and they're just special to that human being. But it is nice to find out the logistics, and it's also just a super fun ride because, like, work is insane. Whether you work at Walmart or work in animation or whatever it is that you do, it's nuts that you spend most of your life doing this, and this is where most of your time goes. So I really enjoy the live tapings to bring everyone together and be like, what are we doing with our lives, and sort of have a fun, cathartic evening.
It's also so much fun to talk to people who are really committed to something, like you said, and are really passionate about it, because they know it seems endless amounts about that thing that they do on a daily basis.
Totally.
And
the rejection.
Pod Save the People. Let's talk about the major differences between the Pod Save shows, right? Pod Save America, Pod Save the World, Pod Save the People. Talk about that.
Yeah, so Pod Save America, great show. They focus a lot on Trump and what's happening in sort of the day-to-day news, right? Pod Save the World focuses on foreign affairs, and Pod Save the People focuses on like issues of race, justice, and equity. And I wanted to create a space where we were having conversations that people weren't having anywhere else. So we don't really talk a lot about Trump because there's a lot of other stuff happening in the world that isn't Trump related, but we need to talk about, like food stamps and the relationship between climate change and child marriages, or like in the pod that comes out tomorrow, we'll talk about like immigration specifically for people under 21, like whole different process, which I didn't even know about. Proud to have had guests like Snowden. He came on and talked about the intersection of like security and race, which like he's never really talked about race anywhere else before. And like it's been an important space for me to like try and think about how do we have these conversations in public. I think about so many of the protests we got in the street because we were trying to bring attention to a crisis that people were trying to act like wasn't happening. A third of all the people killed by a stranger in this country is actually killed by a police officer, which is so wild.
Whoa. A third of all the people killed by a stranger in this country are killed by a police officer,
which is nuts. So if we hadn't stood in the street, we think that people wouldn't be focused on these issues. And the podcast was like, how can we extend that even more? How can we talk about the racial wealth gap in a way that people can like learn and listen to, right? You think about even the racial wealth gap is that in 2053, it's projected that the median wealth for Black people will be 0, which is the lowest that it's been since we've started recording it post-slavery. So it's like wild, but we wanted to be a place where we could talk to experts who'd help us like learn more. I wanted people to leave the podcast like knowing more about the world than when they started.
What does it feel like at this moment in time, talking about what's happening in the world? And I know you are also an activist as well, but what does it feel like to be talking about what's happening in the world and teaching people? Does it still feel, oftentimes when I listen to your show or other shows that are politically minded, I'm like, I'm just listening to something now. Why aren't I moving faster and doing something more?
Yeah. It's people say things like the system is working exactly like it's designed, right? And we would say is that like, the fact that somebody designed it means that we can design something else, right? But part of it means that you have to know how it got there. Like you have to know the pieces. So every episode, I'm trying to think about like, what are the pieces, right? Like, so if we talk about this, I didn't know that there's a whole wing of immigration court that is just for kids under 18. Had no clue, right? So like trying to think about like, how do we have as more people know about that, or even ICE, the immigration police. In the 2009 House Appropriations Bill, there's a clause that says ICE has to detain a minimum of 34,000 people a day. It's the only law enforcement agency at the local, state, or federal level that has a quota. Crazy, right? It's
2009 that was established?
2009 House Appropriations Bill. They have to detain 34,000 people a day. It's one of the reasons why ICE just randomly arrests people. And it's like, how do you, I know, like, why did they put that in the bill? Why is that the law? Doesn't make any sense.
34,000, like, go.
How do we get people who like are experts in this who can talk about like, how we got here, what we can do, what does it mean, like, how do we imagine something different that, like, you can't fight for what you can't imagine. And I thought that Twitter was a beautiful platform, and I love Twitter. I don't know if people are learning on the platform. Like, it's hard to have that back and forth in earnest, and, like, the podcast became a place where I thought that was possible.
Jeremy, talk about what it's like being able to bring fans of these podcasts into a live setting to see them live. I want to say perform because it's not necessarily perform, but.
Well, I think it's really exciting. What's really, I think, great about this year is that a majority of the shows in the festival this year are new to the festival. Out of our lineup, I believe only 3 of the shows are returning. We have Kevin McDonald coming back. We have Risk coming back. We have We Hate Movies, which was in our first festival, coming back. But I'm excited because we're giving a lot of shows either their live debut or like their New York City live debut. So it really is going to kind of be the first chance for like fans in the area who are fans of these podcasts to be in the same room as these podcasters. And I think that's really exciting in the sense of the festival is a platform in a way to bring a lot of different people together and a lot of different voices together. And I think, to me, that's the thing I'm most proud of with the event, is that it's very diverse. It's very different groups of people coming in for very different topics and subjects.
Catie, you have a background in comedy, right? You write comedy. You were trying to become a comedy writer for some time before. You've actually won awards as a writer. How will you change, or will you change, the sort of podcast format now that you're doing it in front of a live audience?
Well, so I've been doing it in front of a live audience for 9 years, and I've been performing for even longer than that. And what I would say is my initial background, though, was working in government and social service. And because I was doing a doctorate in clinical psych, there is an element, I have a moral compass, is what I would say. So that does come out in the podcast. And at the festival, for example, I'll have Masha Gessen, and we will be talking about Russia. And I'm as happy to talk to, who I've had on the show, like Samantha Power, as I am to talk to John Hamm. And that's a really special quality to the show, to see all the different kinds of jobs and careers out there. And my band is part of Lin-Manuel Miranda's Freestyle Love Supreme, which is a hip-hop band that does freestyle improv. So that's also really fun. And a lot of times the guests do perform, which can also be a treat as well.
When you talk to someone like Masha Gessen, is it hard to balance between asking her just about the things that she knows about when it comes to Russia versus how she got to this point in her career, how she writes, how she researches?
I think the hardest element about doing a show live versus the one-on-one podcasts is that the deep dive, which is what I love doing, and because I have so many guests, is not necessarily, I can't go as long with them, but that doesn't mean that you don't learn fascinating things on stage that you actually might not one-on-one. And so I like going between the two, of having these interviews live where the audience is as much a part of the interview. And then I also like doing the podcast one-on-one, and sometimes I'll have guests on both.
DeRay, how do you change the format for the show when you do it live? Do you change the format at all? Do you look to kind of expand it or do something different?
It's a little different. You know, I have a lot of activists and people who have never told their story in a major platform before, right? So it's easier when we record, because if they ramble for 2 hours about prison phone calls, I can just cut them and they sound amazing when we edit, right? Which is a little harder to do live. So with live, we do a lot of prep to just have them think about how to be concise, even if I'm not, I probably won't talk to them before we do it live, but we do a lot to be hey, think about how you'd say this to your aunt. Think about how you talk about this to a kid, just so people who've never talked about foster care. I did an episode with an opioid expert, an expert on drugs, and my first question was what is an opioid? And we had to do it 4 times because he's nobody's ever asked me what an opioid is. And it's well, I don't know what an opioid, So those sort of things, there are a lot of experts who take for granted that they know their piece of the world really, really well, but haven't had to talk about some of the most basic things before. So I'm excited. At the NYC Podfest, we'll have DeRay, who is a writer, and he is great. And we love his writing. We don't always agree about some things about race and justice, but I'm excited to have him. And the podcast is set up so that
he knows a lot about Prince.
He does know a lot. He knows a lot about a lot of hip hop people. Actually, it's incredible. And the podcast is set up so it's the news at the beginning. So it's me, Brittany, Sam, and Clint, and we talk about news that's not in the news, and then it's an interview. So we'll have that same format. They'll be there. It'll be dope. I'm excited, too, because everybody gets to bring their own piece of news, and we don't know other people's news until right before. So it's a fresh take. You're I didn't know that. Or I didn't. Clint one day brought a piece of news about how droughts were impacting child marriages, and whoever thought that climate change had an impact on child marriages, because crops which people used to barter, they can no longer barter, so they're selling kids younger and younger because of climate change. And you're I never thought about that as an environmental justice issue related to child marriages, right? So we all learn so much every episode, and I leave and I'm I didn't think about that, which is cool.
And when you perform it or when you put it up in front of an audience, there's no sense for you guys. Well, you have a band, you said, right?
I have a band, which is really fun. And also sometimes my guests perform, Samantha Power breakdanced and Gloria Steinem tap danced.
Gloria Steinem
tap danced. Please make Masha Gessen dance. The idea of Masha Gessen getting on stage and doing a dance of some kind makes me very happy.
So it can be a lot of fun. And Alex Lacamoire, and actually I'll put up a video today, who did the music behind Hamilton and Dear Evan Hansen. He sang Billy Joel, and you'll have I had a sex therapist on who sang, so it is really fun to go to the live show and have this chance to see people that do stuff you don't normally get to see them do. And I also think be relaxed and have fun, and you so perfectly articulated, like sometimes it's our job, including yours, to break down something that other people may not know and sort of translate it, or, and let them know, like, hey, actually, we need to go to the basics. What is an opiate?
Yeah.
Because actually, it turns out that not everyone is an addict yet. Sorry.
The dystopia hasn't. So we haven't gotten that far into the dystopia yet. Let's get some questions from our audience. Who has a question?
Hi.
Oh, there.
How much do you see where podcasts also have some video involved in? I know you were saying like there was some tap dancing, and for that you probably need a video recording also, like to coincide with the audio. Like, do a lot of podcasts nowadays also have a video aspect to it too?
From what I've kind of observed over the last couple of years, there was like a weird moment where there was a lot of quote unquote video podcasts, which I don't necessarily understand that to an extent, but it seems like that just kind of came and went to a degree. There are like still a bunch of podcasts that like they release like video of them sitting in the studio talking and sitting around, and people will watch that. But the thing that's unique about Catie's podcast is it's been live pretty much the whole history of it, so that's kind of been baked into it.
Yeah, I do. So because it's a labor of love and it was like a scrappy DIY project, it's something that I did whatever I could to help share that information. So there's videos, snippets. Sometimes there's like, if you want to watch the whole Jon Stewart interview or Bobby Cannavale interview, you can. Sometimes there's just snippets from different parts, and we're like, come see the live show, because that's a ride in and of itself. But not everyone can get to New York, so we also have the podcast so that you can listen to individual interviews. And sometimes I just do one-on-one individual interviews because, like, Congressman Barney Frank can't make it in that particular date that we're doing a live show, but he's really worth hearing from. Or Daveed Diggs who's in Hamilton and Blackish, he had so much more to say about being a rapper, so we did a one-on-one interview after the live show. So I use these as all tools. I don't look at it as like, there's no difference to me between radio and podcasting. It's just you're listening to it in a different device or in a different capacity, and I'm just trying to find as many ways as possible without going broke to be able to get these interviews to you all.
Next question.
Hi. Since you guys were talking about how like new podcasts are just coming and there's so many different people that are coming together, do you think the topics are ever going to be limited, or do you think it's going to be endless?
Oh, God, no, it's endless. I see the most niche podcasts pop up every single day, and I'm like, yeah, there's probably listeners for that, I think. Someone is going through, like, minute by minute the movie Clerks, and, like, there's whole podcasts where they take a movie, and every episode is literally discussing 1 minute from that movie, and I'm like, yeah,
Clerks?
That's niche. Yeah, Clerks, like the Kevin Smith movie. So I think the topics are endless. If you're passionate about something, I think what's great about podcasting is there really isn't a limit to what you can talk about. It was, something when I was here last year talking about the festival. What I love about podcasting is you and your friend in the middle of like Idaho can start a podcast about like Star Trek because you love Star Trek, and the hope is that you're going to connect with other people around the country that also share your passion. I think that's what's so powerful about podcasting is it gives a voice to anyone that wants to find connection in the world about things they're passionate about.
I do think that what we'll probably start seeing is more pre-recorded series. I think that will become more of a thing over time, and then shorter ones sort of built for the ride home. That like sometimes they're like hour-long, sort of hour-and-a-half-long podcasts, and there's an audience for that. But I think that the like tight 30 minutes, tight 20 minutes, I think that we'll start seeing that become more of a push.
Oh, like The Daily?
Yeah, like that sort of style, like just the ride home, right? And like not the like LA ride home, which is like a ride home, but the like normal like, had to go to the grocery store, had to go home, like that sort of commute, I think will be an interesting thing. And I'm always interested in news podcasts. You know, I have a news podcast that isn't comedy, right? Like a lot of the news podcasts are like trying to make the world sort of funny, and it's like, well, some of it's not very funny. So how do we talk about it in a way that's like serious, not depressing, empowering, but also sort of like a different take on what's happening, and is not just sort of like a ha, like good look what Trump said. Because the reality is, you think about Trump, is that a lot of the stuff that he's doing has a huge consequence for a lot of people who are not laughing at you saying it on the podcast.
Do you have trouble sometimes talking about the news in an empowering way? Right now, the last episode that you guys put up that was listened to, you were talking about teachers being armed in schools and being trained. I find nothing about that, you know. I just can't find any hope in that, in the fact that that's even being discussed seriously in this country right now. Do you guys have a hard time maintaining a sense of empowerment while you're having those conversations?
And I think that, you know, we always talk about things that we think people can change, right? So in that episode, we talk about how there are places across the country where they are selling like pods that you put in the corner of a room, and it can hold like 25 kids and 2 adults, and it's bulletproof. So like if somebody comes into the room, you like run into the bulletproof pod, and we're talking about like that this is.
You were also saying that there's companies that are making billions of dollars off of basically like creating those
bulletproof
things.
book bags, like those sort of things, right? So we named it to help people realize like this is an industry. So like part of the backlash against gun control is because people are going to be millionaires off these like pods, and like, could you imagine having to be the teacher to be like, I'm sorry, only 25 kids can fit in the pod. Your kid 26, like go hide under the desk. Like that's like a crazy sort of world to imagine.
Not a Snowpiercer.
Yeah, but also like again, like people built this system, right? And the more that like the general public understands like the details, the more armed they are to like go to the city council or go to whatever and be like, this isn't what we want.
And I think also, I mean, because my show can be comedic and it can also be really serious. Like at the beginning, I do an intro, and I did one on how I was looking at gun violence, and I was looking how it's so intractable because even if you go on Etsy, they are selling these boxes that you can leave guns in, whether it's a guitar case to a Holy Bible, and they're unlocked. And I would go contact the people selling them. And so, yes, there are moments when I have humor in my podcast, most importantly because as someone who is directly affected by what's going on, everything from immigration issues to pre-existing healthcare, it affects me directly, the latter. Like, I do take these things personally, and I do need a moment of catharsis, and that's where the humor comes in. And I like being able to have the nuance on a podcast where you can switch between having a light moment where you get to see Ambassador Samantha Power breakdance, and then also have a serious question to her about what are we doing in terms of democratic elections.
Not to derail things, but I actually went to Stoneman Douglas High School. I'm an alumni. So to me, what's going on in the country right now, and with the festival that I run, I feel that, especially this year, I felt it was very important to kind of reflect the conversations that are happening in the country in terms of our programming. When we started, it really was a lot of comedy content, and I think this year, in terms of our topics, it's more diverse than we've ever presented. We do have a lot of political stuff this year, which just like, it would feel disingenuous to do a whole podcast festival and just ignore that side of podcasting. So I'm
shy away from it as if
that's
not
it doesn't
what people are
exist. It's not
talking about.
happening.
Yeah.
Let's all just like sit in a bubble and be oblivious, and like let's have a good time. But it's like, no, we need to kind of reflect in our festival what's going on, like in the world. That's what podcasting is. It reflects what's happening.
Well, guys, I can't wait till next month.
On that note.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great note. It reflects what's happening. I can't wait till next month. Where is the location? What's it called? Excuse me.
It's at the Abrams Art Center on the Lower East Side, April 6th through the 8th, nycpodfest.com. I actually do want to announce something here for the first time. Tickets are going to go on sale for this later in the week, but we're going to be joined by Alex Bloomberg, who is the founder of Gimlet. He's going to be in conversation with Zach Braff about a show called Alex Inc., which is premiering on ABC later this week. It's going to be super exciting, and also the tickets are free. So nycpodfest.com. We're on Twitter at nycpodfest. Keep an eye out for that. But yeah.
Awesome. Everybody give him a round of applause. Let's hear it.